All right, guys. Well, we're going to continue in our study of the prophets. And as I've been doing the past couple weeks, I just want to share with you a little bit more about me, about my family, about what life looks like for me. So my name is Hank Young. I'm the Shea Groups and Enrichment Pastor. I've been doing this for almost a year, coming up on a year. And I want to tell you a little bit more about my life group. So this is them, and let's get it out of the way. Hudson did not enjoy this picture very much that we took of him, clearly. But I moved out here in 2016 when I was 25 years old. And the week before I moved out here, my parents told me that they were going to be getting a divorce. And so right after that, I spent 24 hours driving out here to Arizona. And my head was filled with a lot of lies during that. And leaving Illinois, I left everyone that I knew, every relationship that I have, every friend, every significant person in my life, to a place where I really didn't know anybody. And a few weeks into living out here, I'd gotten a phone call from a family member that just revealed a lot about my parents, and you always get the worst of people whenever a divorce is going on. But I just got some upsetting news, and after I hung up the phone with my sister, I recognized that I needed someone to process through this with, but I didn't have anybody. Lindsay was working as a nurse at the time, and so for a night shift, and so she was at work. All my friends back in Illinois, they were already asleep because of the time change, and I didn't have anybody. So I just remember sitting in my car, angry and frustrated that I felt alone. So it was soon after that I started bumping into these guys that are my group, my people, my family out here now. They've been with us for years. We've gone from working with our young adult ministry to a lot of us have stepped into ministry roles of being pastors in different areas to a lot of us have gotten married and bought houses and graduated college and are now having kids. And we've done all that together. And so these are the people that I go to in moments of crisis, in moments where I don't know what to do next, in moments where I need some direction and I need someone to tell me how they see God moving. These are my guys. So we're going to come back to one of these guys in particular later. But before that, we need to look into Deuteronomy. Hopefully by now, looking at this, you're bored because you've seen it so many times and you're familiar with it. But in order to know where we're going today, we need to look back a little bit. And so looking back at Deuteronomy, again, this is Moses' second telling of the law. And God gives this promise to the people that if they follow the law, if they follow him, they obey him, that they will be blessed, that he will make them a blessing, that he'll make them a great nation, and that he'll be with them. But he gives this warning as well. If they become corrupt and make any kind of idols, that the Lord is going to scatter them among the people so that only a few of them survive. But he finishes up with this. If from there, though, they seek the Lord with everything they have, then they'll find him. And so the prophets, we shouldn't be surprised by the prophets. The Israelites shouldn't have been surprised by the prophets. We shouldn't be surprised by the prophets of what's happening there because they've been told it's going to happen. So looking into this, we spent a few weeks walking through the prophets thus far. And, originally I had titled our summer look at this of what does the Lord require of you? And I want to add like a subtitle to that. I want to add the subtitle of the gospel through the eyes of the prophets. And I want our summer to look at what are the prophets' ideas? What's the picture that the prophets paint of what the gospel looks like? As we've talked before, the prophets do this great job of linking the Old Testament with the New Testament. And so the prophet's message over and over and over again is that the Israelites are not good enough, that they can't fulfill the law, that they've turned their back on God, but they see a solution coming. They always end with saying that the Lord will be the one to remove the sins. The Lord will be the one to redeem the people. The Lord is going to be the one to move in their hearts. And so we get a gospel glimpse from them. So the rest of our summer, that's what I want to do, is I want to spend time looking at what the gospel looks like according to these prophets, including Isaiah. So our very first week, we saw the problem of humanity, that we can't jump this gap that's created by sin that leads us to God. We can't fill the gap. Nothing that we sacrifice will ever be good enough to fill the gap between us and God, and that the Lord requires holiness. We looked at Micah 7, that the Lord promised that he will be the one to remove our sins. He will be the one to remove our iniquities. Last week, we looked at Amos and Hosea, and we saw in Amos a people that did not know God, and so they had no hopes of doing the things that he asked of them, of obeying him, because they didn't know who God was. And so we saw that when we do know God, it results in worship reflected in our actions. The prophet in Amos tells us of the things that God loves and the things that God hates, and God hates their sacrifices. He hates the taste, the smell, the appearance of their sacrifices, but what he loves instead is justice and righteousness. And we talked through that justice is the way that we uphold the covenant among other people, is our relationship to one another, and that righteousness is more about our relationship with God. It is doing everything possible to remove any barrier between the two people of the covenant. So God desires proper relationship with others and a proper relationship with himself. And so when we know God, our worship reflects a change in action. And then in Hosea, we see a different facet of God, a different picture of God, but still the same God. We see a picture of Hosea who marries a prostitute, who leaves him time and time again and prostitutes herself out, has children, and abandons him. And despite his best efforts, she runs away again and again. And this is meant to be a picture of us, be a picture of Israel, the ones who leave God over and over and over again, no matter how many times he beckons them. And we also get a picture of God the Father in this on Father's Day. We can think of this of when he talks about Israel, he refers to Israel as a child that he taught how to walk. And I got to show this really cute video of Hudson whenever he was a little kid. Let's see if we can watch it. There you go. So Ephraim, it says, I taught him how to walk. I took him by the arms. And then it continues on to say that as I taught him to walk, he walked away from me. But there's hope. Is that Hosea talks in chapter 2 about one day God will call to Israel, and he will call Israel his wife, and Israel will call God her husband. And so when we know God, when he does a work in our lives, it changes us, and it's reflected in our adoration of him. So today we're going to be looking at Isaiah, and another quick reminder of the current situation is that the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, are split into 10 tribes to the north of Israel and 2 tribes to the south of Judah. And different prophets are going to give different messages to either the north or the south. Isaiah is going to be speaking to the tribe or the 2 tribes in Judah. And he's going to give them a warning. And it's a similar warning that other prophets have given of this nation of Assyria is going to come. God is going to use this wicked nation of Assyria for his own good. There's some complications that come with Isaiah, though. So Isaiah is a dense book. It's a beautiful book. And there's this one line that I found from a commentary that I was reading through that says, of all the books in the Old Testament, Isaiah is perhaps the richest. Its literary grandeur is unequaled. Its scope is unparalleled. The breadth of its view of God is unmatched. In so many ways, it's a book of superlatives. No wonder that Isaiah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament, and, along with Psalms and Deuteronomy, it's one of the most frequently cited of all the Old Testament books. Study of it is an opportunity for an unending inspiration and challenge. So Isaiah is a book that we could spend a year going through it in the way that we're doing it. We could spend week by week going chapter by chapter, and we would still find ourselves in awe of the content in there. And we get to do it in 2 weeks. So all that to say is it's going to be a wild ride today. We're going to try to pull out some truths of the first half of the book, and then we'll spend next week looking at the later half of the book. But here's our main points. I always want to give you those right up front. It's that an attempt to find our worth in our work renders it meaningless. Point 2 is that submission to God redeems our work and our own value. And number 3 is that in looking at these things, we must be the ones that instruct our heart. Get our story started is that I grew up in the 90s, and that was the Beanie Baby fad. A lot of you guys probably remember Beanie Babies. Maybe some of you guys remember standing in endless lines waiting for to buy one Beanie Baby for a child or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew, and holding on to what would hopefully be an increased value in that of this collectible toy. Well, it got started by this guy named Ty Warner. About 30 years ago, he had this idea of these toys, these plush characters that were moldable, that were movable. So the problem that he had with other toys similar to this is that you couldn't really move them. You couldn't play with them. They weren't pliable. Yet he wanted to make one that were filled with beans, but were still moldable and playable. So the Beanie Baby was born. And Ty had kind of two obsessions in his company of Beanie Babies. One is he was always making small edits, little corrections to their nose or to their eyes or the length of their tail. And so there were several different editions of each different Beanie Baby. And then two is not only was he obsessed with selling as many as he could, but he wanted to sell them at the greatest profit that he could. And so he went about figuring ways to manipulate the market. Well, as Beanie Babies hit their peak, Ty runs into a problem. There is a disruption in the distribution of one of the toys, and the creation of one of the toys, where the manufacturer wasn't able to get the supplies that they needed. And so there's this big to-do where they eventually would just have to cancel the production of one of the toys. And so normally what would happen is that this toy would become discontinued. Most of the time it would drop in value, it would stop selling, nobody would want it anymore. But Ty tried to get ahead of this by saying that it's not that the toy was discontinued, it's that it was being retired. And so this little phrase, retired, what he noticed is about this toy is that instead of the value of the toy decreasing and the demand for the toy decreasing as it was seen as an older model, it was now seen as a collectible, and the price increased. And so Ty started this process of every few months retiring different waves of the toys that started to drop in value in order to artificially increase their value momentarily. Something else that he did was he created scarcity in the market. And so he would intentionally give different sides of the country, different parts of the country, different quantities of these in order to create artificial scarcity. So to one side, he would give plenty of one toy, and then to the other side, he would give a scarcity of the same. And it created a desire in the areas that it was less available. And so again, the price for those toys increased. Well, along with Ty himself creating a false market here of inflation, is that there were these women that caught on to this. There are these ladies that lived out in Chicago that found out where they were being manufactured, and started to buy directly from the manufacturer in Germany, I think it was. And so they would have these stockpiles of certain Beanie Babies, and they had different people that would go into stores and they would purchase large quantities of them. And so they had amassed quite a number of Beanie Babies, and they started to write articles in newspapers about how much some of these Beanie Babies should cost. Now remember, they have large quantities of certain Beanie Babies, and so to those, they said that there should be an increased price in them. They had bought up a portion of the stock, a portion of the supply, and so they thought that they were going to be more valuable. And so they actually wrote a book where they determined the price of the Beanie Babies. And ironically, the ones that had a higher price were the ones that they owned a lot of. And so they made quite a fortune off of this. In the midst of this, again, you probably remember waiting in lines of stores, and in waiting in lines at McDonald's, even when they had the miniature versions for sale, where people would buy up to 200 Happy Meals at a time just to get the miniature Beanie Babies. This craze took on so much so that there's actually reports from the police where they would trade drugs for Beanie Babies. These things were a hot commodity and so valuable. And in the middle of this, I remember in our house, there were 3 Beanie Babies in my closet in my room that were a purple, a green, and a white bear. And these were put in a plastic container with plastic over their tags, and they were sealed so that I couldn't play with them. And for years and years and years, my mom would look at those, and when I asked why I couldn't play with them, she would say, because one day, those 3 bears are going to pay for your college tuition. The hope was that these things would retain their value, increase in value, and that they would be collectibles so that one day we could sell them and pay for my college. And that was our plan for college. But you guys, looking at this 30 years in the future, you guys know what happened to Beanie Babies. One round of retirements that Ty set out is he noticed that the sales for those newly retired Beanie Babies didn't increase nearly as much as they used to. And the next round of retirements, the sales increased even less and less and less and less, until you started to see Beanie Babies 2 for $5 They'd be in the dollar bins. They would be in resale shops. They'd be in garage sales. They'd be given to dogs as chew toys and kids as drool toys. And as quickly as they came, overnight, they seemed to have lost their value. And I still have those 3 Beanie Babies in my closet from my childhood that were supposed to pay for my college tuition. The point of this story is that Beanie Babies, like all things made by our own power, made by humanity, is they will eventually lose their value. My dad taught me this in the middle of this Beanie Baby fad. He said, the things of mankind, the things of humanity will eventually deteriorate, but the things of God, in contrast, will only increase in value. And it's a lesson that's not just true of Beanie Babies, but of everything. And it's a lesson that Isaiah is going to try to teach the people and that we're going to try to learn today. So Isaiah, like so many of the other prophets, starts off with the problem. Isaiah chapter 2, he lists the problem of the Israelites. He says, for you have rejected your people, O house of Jacob, because they're full of things from the east, and the fortune tellers like the Philistines. They strike hands with the children of foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there's no end to their treasures, and their land is filled with horses and with chariots. The Israelites are putting confidence in the same thing that the nations around them are putting their confidence in their military power and in their physical possessions. He talks about a land from the east and then also the Philistines. And so to give you a map really quick of what we're looking at is, look at that. To the east, we have the Babylonian and the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonians that are growing in power, and then the Assyrians, who are the world power at the time. And then to the west, he points out the Philistines. So he's saying that you are just like the nations that surround you. You're taking your worth, you're finding your value, you're finding your security in the things of the world, of the things that you are able to create on your own. And this is explicitly condemned in Deuteronomy. God says that if Israel is to have a king, they are not to amass things like this. They're not to put stock in these things. And that's exactly, though, what Solomon did. Solomon built up a large military power. He counted his chariots, and David, another great king of Israel, did the same thing. He took a census where he found his military power, and God punished him because of that. As the Israelites, again, are doing the same thing that they have been doing for hundreds of years, is that they're putting stock in their own possessions, in their own power, instead of depending on God. The desire for security offered by the world led to this assimilation in the world. And unless power is understood to be given by God, truly God's power, it would prove to be an affliction for them. All these things, all that they've acquired, actually pulls them away from their dependence on God, their recognition of God, away from the relationship he intends to have with them. And it replaces that with an illusion of control, an illusion of strength, and an illusion of power. Isaiah continues on. He says that their land is filled with idols, things made by them, their own hands. Isaiah is the one that comically shows that one piece of wood can be used for multiple things, and that one might be burned up in a fire, but another is made into an idol, and that's what you bow down to and worship, the work of your own hands. Things are made by your own fingers. Then he gives a punishment for this in verse 9. So man is humbled, and each one's brought low. He commands that God, he says that God should not forgive them. The emphasis of this is that they perceive all this is coming, all the strength that they have, any military might that they have is a work of their own hands. And then he transitions to that effect there, that they are going to be brought down low. And so, again, in the prophets, we often get the warning of here's where you have gone wrong, and then they give the effect, the judgment. And a lot of times that's called the day of the Lord. And remember, the day of the Lord, we've characterized it as it's God's justice coming down. For those that have been oppressed, they are exalted. And then for those that have been the oppressor, they're brought down low. And so that's this next section in Isaiah. He tells them that they're going to enter into the rock, and they're going to hide in the dust before the terror of the Lord. And that the haughty looks of men are going to be brought down low, and the lofty pride of men shall be humbled. The things that are up high will be brought down low, and the things that are low will be brought up high. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And God's going to now list the things that he's against. And he's going to start off with 4 things that are of a natural occurrence, and he's going to pair that with 4 works of humanity. Against the cedars of Lebanon in verse 13, against all the oaks of Bashan, against the lofty mountains, and against the uplifted hills, things that are physically tall, things that are physically grand and mighty, that are things that God has made. Now he'll contrast that with the things that man has made. The God is against every high tower, against every wall, against every ship of Tarshish, against every beautiful craft. That God is against everything that they have created, that humanity has created on their own, to be lifted up. That God will bring those things down low, because God alone is going to be exalted in that day. What about the people here? Their creation will be brought down low, but what about the people? The people will enter into the caves of rocks and the holes in the ground. And they're going to cast away, in verse 20 talks about, they will cast away their idols. They'll realize their little value that they have. They'll give these things that are worth, that have monetary value, to the moles and to the bats that live in the holes in the caves along with them. And again, 21 reemphasizes they'll enter the caves of the rocks and the clefts of the hill. And this whole section here, 21 and 22, reminds us a little bit of the Garden of Eden. That humanity is now going to reign from the caverns and the clefts, yet that is not what they were designed to do. In the Garden of Eden, God gives the command for them to be fruitful and to multiply, to have dominion over the earth. That was the intention of humanity, to be reigning over the earth, because of the power and the might of God, because of what he says about them, and because of what he has created them to do. That is how they will reign. But yet when they lift up the things of their own power, of their own strength, he will bring them down low. And so instead of being these heirs with God, instead of being co-heirs with Christ, instead of being sons and daughters of the King and living in that identity, they have taken it upon themselves to craft things, to create things on their own. And because of that, they are brought down. Now, instead of being co-heirs with Christ, they are ruling from caverns and clefts. In verse 22, it says, "Stop regarding man, in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he?" Again, it reminds us of Eden, the very air in their nostrils, the very breath of life that they have, was only given to them by God. Again, everything that they do has been given to them by God. The very breath in their lungs is given to them by God. They are so dependent on God, yet they are acting in a way as to be independent. Again, it is an illusion of strength and power and control, because not even the breath that they breathe, something that they take for granted thousands of times a day, is their own, but it is given to them by God. And we have this introduction of the paradox of faith, that just as Jesus said, is that that when he returns, the things of low will be exalted, but the things that are exalted will be brought down low. And this is a paradox. That God does the same thing, is that when we lift up ourselves and our own ability and our own strengths and our own powers, is that we will be brought down low, because eventually the things of man will deteriorate and crumble and pass with time. Yet, if we submit to God, he will bring us up. He will exalt us. Just to give a little further explanation, further insight of the degree of emptiness that's come for the people. It says, "For a man will take hold of his brother in the house and saying, 'You have a cloak? You're going to be our leader, and you're going to rule over this heap of ruins.'" And so as to say that even when people have nothing, you're still going to find a reason to give them power and strength and authority, and think that they have something to offer. And then the very last verse that we'll look at for this is 25 and 26. "Your men will fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle, and her gates shall lament and mourn empty. She shall sit on the ground." Israel's been accused of finding the strength in their own ability. This power that they have is really, it's only an illusion. It's going to fade. It's going to disintegrate. It's going to become dust, nothingness. So we see our first point. The attempt to find our worth in our work renders it as meaningless. When we look at the things that we create on our own, if we find any value of that, eventually it's going to be destroyed. Eventually it's going to be rendered as meaningless. Now we're going to contrast that with one who finds his value in Christ, and one who submits to God, and his work and value are redeemed. One of the more famous passages in Isaiah 6, is Isaiah's calling. And it starts off with, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. A couple things on this. King Uzziah is viewed as a very good king. He was a great king of Judah, and one of his big flaws, his big mess ups, though, is that he stepped into the place of a religious practice, is that he stepped into the role of a priest, whether it is through disobedience or arrogance or I don't know if he just didn't know or what, but he stepped into the role of a priest, and because of that, God punished him and he died. But he was viewed as a good king of the nation. That he was one of the prime examples of great leadership. But when he died, Isaiah sees an even better king, the one Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up. And you'll see there that, remember, in the past, all the things that were high were brought down low, and all the things of low were brought down high. But here we see the one who is deserving to be sitting up on a high and lifted place. And the train of his robe fills the temple. And above him were 2 seraphim. Each had 6 wings, with 2 covering the face, 2 covering the feet, and 2 that flew, and they called to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And so we have to ask ourselves, what does holiness mean here? What is the holiness of God? Well, it's a distinction of divine from all other things. It's not only separation due to the role of God being God, but also his adherence to the law, which is critical to his character. And he calls his people to be holy as he is. His holiness describes his ethics, his absolute uprightness, his being utterly true. And he is not a holy one. He is the Holy One. He is set apart from what is set apart. And that's why we get that holy, holy, holy. You've probably heard this before, is that to say things twice over, holy, holy, means that it has the absolute character of that. So to say it a third time is to say that even the most holy of holy things, God is the more holy than that, a magnitude higher in its holiness. He's not only separate, but he's separate from what is separate. To the magnitude that anything can be different and set apart, that degree again is God separated from it. The holiness, he is magnitudes above. As holy as something could be on earth, more so is God's holiness a degree greater than even that. So I think of it this way, is on a Richter scale, when we measure earthquakes, we use a sliding scale. And you'd think that from the number 8 to the number 9, a huge earthquake to a catastrophic earthquake, that it would maybe double in strength or double in its destruction, but it actually has an increasing power of a multiple of 33. And so I like to think of this in the same way, is that it's not just more holy, but it's to a magnitude of infinite. Even that's comparison of a multiple of 33 pales in comparison to the holiness of God. That's all these angels do day and night, is clarify, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. It's not just that God is a God of the nation of Israel, and that is as far as his power and strength go. It's that the whole earth is full of his glory. The whole earth is subject to his will. And that is why God can use even a wicked nation like Assyria to do his will, to bring the nation of Israel back to himself. Well, verse 4 continues, "And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the whole house was filled with smoke." And as Isaiah looks around, as he looks at all this, as he looks at the magnitude of God, as he looks at these seraphim and he hears them singing, "Holy, holy, holy," he begins to draw his attention to himself. He describes, "Woe is me, for I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." How interesting that in this majestic moment where we see the might and the power and the glory of God, the thing that Isaiah sees as the biggest contrast between him and God is that he's unclean. Again, emphasizing how holy God is, that he is separate in magnitudes above all. Well, the seraphim remedy this. One of the seraphim flew at him, having in his hand a burning coal that had been taken from the altar. And he touched Isaiah's mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sins are atoned for." Isaiah is in despair. He is distraught because of the separation between God, and the seraphim take care of his problem. They cleanse him. And notice that they put it at his mouth. They touch his mouth to cleanse him. Matthew 12 talks about that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. James talks about this as well, is that the what is said is reflective of our hearts. And so when these seraphim cleanse his mouth, they're cleansing his entire body. And so this isn't just a ceremonious or ritual cleanliness by waiting a few days or of washing your hands a certain number of times. It's not cleanliness in that way. It is actual cleanliness. It is, his guilt is actually taken away and his sins are atoned for. Again, we see that God fixes the problem where we are unclean and there's nothing we can do to get to God, yet he is the one that takes care of the problem. And from here, he hears the voice of God. God speaks and says, "Who shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." As the God of the universe says, there is a mission, I need someone to go and do my will, Isaiah raises his hand and said, "Would I do? Would I do?" Our second point here is that submission to God redeems our work and redeems our value. When Isaiah looks at God and says, "Woe of me, I am unclean. There's nothing that I can do that's good enough." There's a seraphim that comes and cleanses him and then calls him. God is the one that cleanses. God is the one that calls. God is the one that commissions the work of Isaiah, bringing value to what he does, giving God the glory for what God does. So we see again that when we submit ourselves to God, he redeems the work. He redeems the value. So how does this play out in the next couple chapters? Well, right afterward, we see a contrast of Isaiah. We saw Isaiah as the one that submits to God, and now we'll see one who doesn't submit to God, Ahaz. In the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that guy that we really liked, while Ahaz was reigning, Rezin, the king of Assyria, and Pekah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. Ahaz is in a pickle here, all right? Again, in this military conflict that's going on where Assyria is growing in strength, all the surrounding nations are trying to figure out how not to be conquered by Assyria. Assyria seems like Germany in the 30s and 40s, where they are able to attack anywhere at any time with full strength, and the rest of the nations have to come together in order to stand up against them. And so the northern kingdoms of Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, they make an alliance with Damascus, Syria. And in doing so, they stop depending on God, and they ask, they see if Judah would like to join as well. Judah has this choice. 3 options is: 1, do they do nothing? 2, do they join this alliance with Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and also with Syria? Or 3, do they join in an alliance with the Assyrian Empire, the ones that are the looming at their doorstep that seem like they're going to take them over at any point in time? Well, Isaiah comes to Ahaz with a message. And the message that he gives to Ahaz is, don't worry, you don't need to do anything. God will take care of this. There's going to be some punishment for the nation of Judah because of their disobedience, but you are not going to be destroyed. God will protect you. You only have to depend on God, not your own strength. And he even gives the king a sign. He tells Ahaz not to fear, and here's the sign that he gives him. All right, the Lord is going to give you a sign, even though you didn't ask for it. Behold, a virgin, just meaning a young woman in this case, shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall name him Emmanuel. So the sign at the time, this thing that is also a messianic prophecy, but in the current moment it means something too. Ahaz is going to find a woman who has given birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, meaning God with us, because God is still with the people despite any punishment that they're going to receive. And then he finishes it like this. He says in verse 16 that before the boy knows how to refuse evil and good, the land whose 2 kings you dread, of Syria and of Israel, will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such a day as they have not seen since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. He says that the Assyrian Empire is going to take care of this problem for them, that God is going to use the Assyrian Empire. Well, this comes to take place where Judah kind of gets chunks nibbled out of it from surrounding nations, is that they take city after city, fortified city after fortified city, and that even Syria comes down and lays waste to the land. So Syria comes and takes 200,000 people captive and kills the very best soldiers that Judah has. And so in the middle of this, King Ahaz starts to panic. King Ahaz starts to think, maybe God is not a God of his word. Maybe God isn't strong enough to help me out. Maybe this isn't going to work, and maybe I need to rely on my own strength, something that I can do on my own. And so he makes a plan. He sends a word to the Assyrian Empire and says, hey, I want to make a treaty with you. Will you save us? Will you protect us? And in this, he's submitting to Assyria instead of God. He is in effect saying to Assyria, I'm your servant. I'm your son. Come up and deliver me from the hands of the kings of Israel and of Syria. And it's sad news, because Ahaz was under God's care, but he turns away from God, his true father, and tells the king of Assyria, I'm your servant. I'm your son. And what makes this worse is Ahaz actually pays for this help when God was going to do it for free. And to pay for this, he uses gold and silver from God's temple. And we see the results are pretty dire. Just a few verses later, it says, the Lord spoke to me again, speaks to Isaiah, because this people has refused the water of Shiloah, which gently flows, and rejoice over Rezin, the son of Remaliah. That's again one of these two kings. Therefore, behold, the Lord will bring up against them waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all of his glory. He says, because you didn't depend on me, representing by these gentle waters, because you didn't depend on me, I'm going to send a mighty river. This is referring to the Euphrates River, that is stronger and more forceful than any river that is in Israel. And they're going to overflow, and they're going to take over. And it says that they will rise over its channels and go over its banks, and it will sweep into Judah, and it will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck. Water is symbolized in the Old Testament as chaos. A lot of times it's scary. To be caught in the water is a scary and fearful moment for these people. Their experience with this would probably extend only to the Jordan River. See, when the Jordan River floods, it expands more than 2 miles in length compared to its dry season average width of about 100 feet. Once the Jordan spreads over its banks, it can't be stopped. And it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. This is maybe a picture that we get today. Maybe something more familiar is whenever there was Hurricane Katrina, when the levees broke and the water spread and it spread and it spread, and there was no hopes of stopping it, and the water rose and it rose and it rose. This prophet describes that the Assyrian nation is not only going to take over Israel and Syria, but it's going to come up to the neck of Judah. It's going to be waiting at their doorstep in Jerusalem, nearly overtaking them, but God will stop them. So my question for us is, as we take a pause on this, is to think through, what are the things that feel like they're coming up to our neck? What are the things that feel so fearful in our lives, that make us nervous, that take the breath away from us, that cause us fear and anxiety? What is it that takes the air out of our lungs? Is it our job? Is it our finances, that as maybe a recession is in the future of looking at this 401k that you've spent 30, 40 years building up and starting to disintegrate, and you're starting to worry about the future? What you've accumulated your whole life seems to be slipping through your fingers, or maybe it's your family, that every time you get together, there's some stress, there's some pain there, that there's a family member that's an unbeliever that you pray for all the time, but every time you get together, it just seems that there's fights and arguments, and it seems as though the air is being taken out of your lungs. Maybe you just look at culture and politics and anxiety and depression, and you look at the world, and it just seems that things are falling away from God, and it just gets worse and worse day by day by day, and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, like Ahaz, we have two options. We can either put our trust and our faith in our own abilities, in people, in the things that we can make, in our own military power, in our own works of our own hands, or we can trust God, that he knows what he's doing. Well, as I said, Ahaz trusted in the military strength of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians took over, and they did indeed come up to the neck of Judah. They got so far as to the gates of Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. And we see another story unfold. It's a story of Ahaz's son, Hezekiah. Hezekiah has the same message, receives the same message that the Assyrian Empire now is knocking at their door, and all he has to do, all that Hezekiah has to do, is trust in God. It gets so bad that even the Assyrians are even mocking him, saying, "Who is this God that you have? We've taken over land after land after land with people that say the same thing of their gods that you do of yours, that he's going to deliver them, and they don't." And Hezekiah does the opposite of Ahaz. Instead of looking for other powers, instead of depending and counting on his military strength to be able to defend them, instead of being able to turn to his own strength, he turns to God. And he gives this prayer to God where he rips his clothes and he pours ashes on his head and he says, "Look, yeah, it's true. The Assyrians have taken over people group after people group, but that is because they have no gods, but their gods were the work of man's hand, of wood and stone. But our God is not. We have a living God who will save us. They're not going to come into our city. They're not going to shoot an arrow. They're not going to be able to do anything. And by the way that they came, so they're going to return." And God promises that he will defend the city. Hezekiah doesn't turn to his own strength, but instead turns to God's. And that is a hard thing to do. But he had to instruct his heart. I'm sure his heart looked around, looked at all the other nations and saw that they were falling, that they were crumbling before the Assyrian Empire. I'm sure he had people around him who were telling him to submit to another nation for protection, to give himself up to the Assyrian Empire. But instead, he trusts God. He is the one that instructed his heart. Even though times looked bad, things looked rough, is our last point here, is that we must instruct our hearts. Despite the situation, we must be the ones to instruct our heart. Remember what I said earlier, is that power, abilities, strengths, wealth that we amass, it's an illusion. This control that we think we have, it's just an illusion. So sometimes our hearts don't see that, and so we have to be the ones that go forward to instruct our hearts, who say, "I know what God has said, and I know what it looks like. So we're going to follow him. I know it looks bad, but we are going to hold to what he has said." And God does something amazing. Hezekiah submits to God. He says, "God, you do what you're going to do. You do your part, I'll do my part. Whatever you need of me, I'll do, but God, you do your part." And this is what God does. In verse 36, it says, "The angel of the Lord went and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians." This military that was surrounding the city of Jerusalem, waiting for them to surrender. God struck down 185,000 of them. And those people, the Assyrian army, then the next morning when they saw these dead bodies, got up and they left. And it's crazy. We don't just see this in the Bible. It's actually recorded from this Assyrian king. He went on to record on this tablet that's now in the British Museum that he did indeed surround Hezekiah. It says that he locked him up like a bird in a cage. But then the story ends. All of a sudden, we see that the king turns around and he goes back home. And he never takes over Jerusalem, despite being in the best situation to do so, despite having the city surrounded, despite having stronger military, despite all these things that they should have won this victory. He says that he had Hezekiah stuck like a bird in a cage. And then the next wording is that he went home. Hezekiah trusted God, and God followed through. Hezekiah didn't put his strength in his own military power, in the power of his own hands, anything that he made, anything that he accomplished, any works of mankind, but he trusted in God. I want to show you one more time this picture of our friends, and zoom in on one guy in particular. This guy up here, his name's Austin. Austin graduated college in 2019 and had a wonderful girlfriend that he was about to propose to. He had a wonderful job lined up. He's an energetic, charismatic kid that we all recognized was going to do awesome things. And just a few months after he graduated, when he's just about to kickstart his life, he bumps his head on something at work. And he gets a concussion from it. And so he goes in to get a scan of this concussion, and they find that he has a tumor in his brain. And then they do blood work on this tumor and they find out that he has leukemia as well. And so in a matter of days, all these things that Austin had built up, a great relationship, a great job, a wonderful degree, all these things that he had lined up, stopped being so important. They didn't matter so much because of this diagnosis. And he went in for treatment. You'll remember 2020, he spent most of the year in the hospital by himself. And again, just as he sat there in the hospital bed, he had this recognition that those things don't matter. Those things will fade eventually. Is that jobs won't last forever. Any house that he bought wouldn't last forever. None of these things that he could put his own strength in, anything that he could put his own hand to, would have any worth eventually. So we would keep up with Austin and we'd ask him how he was doing. And he just told us over and over again he goes, I could put my trust in doctors, but eventually they'll fail. He had this really good perception that he said, yeah, it's like 95% likelihood that he's going to get through this. And he goes, but 5% of people put their confidence in doctors and it doesn't go so well for them. And he goes, the only place I can put my confidence and my faith is in God. Now, Austin made a full recovery. Last week, he actually took his last chemo pill. Full recovery. He's married. His wedding was just a huge celebration of this victory that God had given him over cancer. And but he is a hero of faith in so many of our minds. Is that he looked at the things of the world and truly his perspective was that these things won't last. They're going to fail. We're not promised any of these things. And it's the same perspective as Hezekiah. It's the same message that Isaiah is giving us, is that you have two options when it comes both to your salvation and for your day-to-day. Is one, is you can put your confidence in the things that you can make. You can put your confidence in man. You can put your confidence in the things that you can see. But eventually, they'll disintegrate. Eventually, they'll be broken down. Eventually, they will be empty and nothing. Or you can submit to God. You can recognize that he is the giver of all good gifts, that he is the one that is in control, that he is the one whose glory fills the entire earth, that he has the power. And when we submit to God, God lifts us up. God redeems our work. God is the one that receives credit and glory. And God is not calling us to sit and do nothing. Hezekiah has this really cool story, actually, of what he does. But God is calling us to obey him. And when we obey God, he is the one that receives credit and glory. And we see that the things of God do not deteriorate. That in comparison to the things of man, the things of God are actually magnified and receive more credit and glory. And so let us tell our hearts those things. Let us, whenever we are discouraged and are tempted to fall back on our own powers and abilities, let us be the ones to instruct our hearts for the things of God, not for the things of man. Let's pray.